Spain after the Civil War, from No Outspan by Deneys Reitz. The Portuguese government now very kindly placed a car at my disposal for the first leg of the journey to Marseille, and in order to avoid a repetition of the previous annoyance from Spanish soldiers and officious officials, Senor Saldanha was deputed to accompany me. I invited Colonel Pinar, our minister plenipotentiary, to join me and Mr. Cooper and Miguel, our driver, a queer old character who, in his day, had been an all-in wrestler of considerable fame. The four of us made up the party. I took formal leave of President Carmona, Dr. Machado, the other ministers, the British ambassador, who was lying in bed with a broken jaw, and many other friends, and at daybreak one morning we set out. We crossed the Tagus on a pontoon, and travelling through the lovely Portuguese countryside, reached the Spanish frontier by 11 o'clock in the morning. Thanks to Senor Saldanha, the formalities of crossing into Spain took less than 20 minutes, instead of 8 hours, as on the former occasion. And on behalf of the Union of South Africa, I sent a long telegram to the President of Portugal, thanking him and his administration for their kindness to me. We went on. Soon we were passing through Badajoz with its famous breach where Sir George Grey's father was killed in 1806. When this fortress was captured recently by Franco's troops, there were, I was told, horrible scenes of massacres and executions. Our road took us by Talavera and Merida, and we saw picturesque castles and towers dating from Moorish times, and the ruins of Roman bridges and aqueducts. These parts were more or less unspoilt by the Civil War, but everyone seemed poverty-stricken and listless, and I did not see a decently clad man, woman, or child anywhere in Spain. Tea, coffee, sugar, and bread were not to be had. Shops were empty, and the few cars we passed were incredibly dilapidated. As a rule, their windows were broken, and sacking was used instead of glass. At intervals were huge collections of derelict cars, buses, and lorries, each about 1,000 strong, and I was told that these had transported the local Red Armies in their last stand near the frontier. They were too far gone for salvage. Refugees were moving along the roads, pushing barrows and handcarts containing their belongings. They were Reds returning from Portugal, where they had found sanctuary up to now. The weather was bitterly cold, and I noticed that towards dark, these unfortunate people halted in the lee of the stone walls around the fields for shelter from the wind, and there they crouched and shivered through the night. The country beyond Badajoz was more or less unscarred, but by the time we neared Madrid, the scene had changed. We crossed a snow-covered mountain chain, and beyond that, towns and villages were in ruins. Bridges had been destroyed, and lines of trenches ran out of sight on either side. The actual approaches to Madrid and the suburbs were heaps of rubble, and we had to make frequent detours to avoid fallen masonry that blocked the road. The bridge over the Manzanis, the gateway to the capital, was lying in the water below, so we had to make a long turn with entire blocks burnt out, and there were deep craters where bombs had torn up the streets. The people looked depressed, and one sensed an undercurrent of hatred from their bitter looks as they eyed each other. We spent a night at the Ritz, said once to have been the finest hotel in Europe, but now doors hung awry. There were no locks or latches, the carpets were worn, and the whole place reeked of decay. Meals were served in a magnificently proportioned dining room, but consisted chiefly of goat's meat. No bread, no sugar, milk, tea, or coffee. Many of the guests were Moorish officers, and there were Moorish troops on the streets. A supporter of the Franco regime told me a grisly tale. He said that during the first weeks of the Troubles, the Reds had seen red in Madrid. They killed every policeman they could find, as these were considered to be hostile to the revolution. They were stripped and eviscerated, and the naked corpses were hung on the flesh hooks of every butcher shop, exposed to public view besides the carcasses of cattle and sheep. He told me further that in the courtyard of the Quartel de la Montagne, a military barracks, the Reds herded 120 loyalists, officers, and machine-gunned the lot. Then they forced the city photographers to take pictures of the scene for distribution among the public. In the evening paper was an account of the reburial that morning of 102 nationalist officers shot by the Reds at Almeida. From Madrid we went to Saragossa. All along our route the villages were as completely ruined as those in the devastated zone in France during the Great War, and shell-pitted trenches crisscrossed in every direction. These parts had been held by the Reds for 3 years, and it looked as if the country was not yet pacified, for we met squadrons of cavalry on patrol and long convoys of mule carts driven by angry-looking peasants with soldiers in charge. We gathered that the troops were forcibly requisitioning supplies, though they could not have been very successful, as this area was largely derelict. From Saragossa to Barcelona, we went through country heavily fought over. The bridges were down, towns and villages were destroyed, and we saw fresh graveyards with hosts of wooden crosses like those I remembered behind the lines in France. The inhabitants of the region were chiefly anti-Franco. They looked downtrodden and resentful, but at a few kind words they would break into laughter and jokes. We continued to Barcelona on the Mediterranean coast. The place had been heavily battered during the disturbances, and the seafront, in especial, was in ruins. From Barcelona, the next day, we went north. At first the road runs almost on the beach for a number of miles, and then it turns inland. All this country is strongly pro-red, and Franco was not taking any chances, for everywhere troops were marching and counter-marching. In most places the bridges had been dynamited by the Red armies during their final retreat to the French border, and frequently we had to leave the main road to make our way along muddy routes vicinales, so we lost much time. On every hand was evidence of the passage of the defeated Red armies. To them it must have been a Via Dolorosa. Dead cars and lorries and buses strewed the way, and every town and village had been reduced to rubble. Shortly before we came to the frontier, there lay the world's biggest scrap heap. There must have been 15 to 20,000 motor vehicles of every description, all smashed or rendered useless by the Reds before they crossed over into France, and I was told that nearly 100,000 refugees had gone by. At a small post in the Pyrenees, we had a last encounter with Spanish officialdom, but thanks to Soldana and Colonel Pinar, we were not delayed above an hour. Then the civil guard gave us their salute by placing their hands over their hearts, and before long we were on French soil once more.